going like, Brooke, I didn't see you there.
Right.
You
Oh,
know, but
happen. How crazy. You're
how
just
crazy
here.
is it that we would be on a Zoom call that you sent me an invite to?
I'm here in Utah. You're there in Washington. It just snowed here. We've had like 3 or 4 days of snow, so it's cold. But I think you're probably colder. Washington is kind of going through a real cold spell this winter already, aren't you?
It was 28 degrees this morning when I
Oh,
walked to the bus.
okay.
Depending on where you're from, that's either really cold or really balmy.
Right.
Uh, and for me, I can't stand it. I want the warmer weather. So,
See, I'm that way. I'm here in Utah. It wasn't 28. I think we did get down to about that a couple days ago, but for the most part, we don't get too much colder than 30-ish. I did spend like a year, a little over a year in Quebec, in Montreal, and that was cold. Like props to our Canadian friends because it was seriously like -60 when I'd go outside in the winters with the wind factor, the wind chill. And I just remember like those first moments when you open the door and you take in that breath and you like freeze, you literally freeze. And I was like, I'm not a winter person.
no, I'm not a
So
winter person either.
yeah, I'd be down in the sunshine all the time if I could be. But
Yep.
anyway, okay. Well, so about Washington though, like what are some things you really love doing there?
Oh gosh. Well, I enjoy drinking a whole lot of coffee.
Okay.
I do that quite a lot.
Okay.
Uh, but I I love hiking. I don't get to go nearly as much. I sort of live vicariously through my family because
Okay.
they get to go hiking sort of in the spring and summer, in the fall, in the sort of in the middle of the week when it's not so busy.
Right.
But when I do get to go, it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. I think Washington has some of the best national parks and places to go hiking and exploring of
Nice.
anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's lovely.
I would like to go there more. My father is actually from Washington, so when I was younger, we went there only a few times, but I was so young, I don't remember a whole lot, but it's one of those states where I've said I really want to go and explore more. So it's on my to-do list, but I'll have to ask you what are good hiking trails when I go.
I will happily help you with that. No worries.
Excellent. 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 Well, okay, I'm really eager to have you here because I want to talk about the Angular docs, and you used to work for Google as was it the lead technical writer on?
I had a lot of different roles within documentation at
Okay,
Google, but the last role I had was the lead writer for Angular. That's
okay. So that's what I want to talk about though, is from a learning perspective, how can someone use the docs? Because I think it's really easy for someone to say, well, just go look it up in the docs, or go do this, like go refer to it there. But that's not so easy for some people. I remember when I was brand new to programming and the first couple times somebody said to go look up the docs, I was like, docs, what? What are you talking about? So I mean, coming from different perspectives, I think it can be a little off-putting and overwhelming to people, especially where you get into such technical jargon. But you worked really hard and did an excellent job at making those Angular docs as approachable as possible. And so that's what I want to dig into is how can someone, be they new to programming or new to Angular or not, even someone who's more advanced, how can they use the documentation to learn new skills, to get more familiar with updates and things like that. But I'm eager to get into it and hear your perspective because I think you have a really unique like your experience is just unique coming in. And so yeah, anyway, I'm excited to get into it, but I always like to start by playing a game just as a fun way to like get to know who you are a little bit more. And one thing I just absolutely I loved, like, the first time we really met was back, was it 2020 when you gave the talk at ng-conf, or was it 2021?
I think it was 20. I think it must have been 2021. It
Okay.
must have been. Because I
Okay.
remember that the first ng-conf was around 20 that I attended was 2020. It was the first virtual one. So
Okay.
and I was just an avid watcher, listener, or whatever at that one.
Nice.
So
Okay. Okay. So 2021, and you submitted a proposal to do a lightning talk. And that was back when I was working for ng-conf. And so I was in charge of basically the whole lightning talks. I was in charge of running that, and just instantly fell in love with the idea that you proposed, which was talking about the importance of documentation, but in Dr. Seuss style.
right.
And so your whole talk was done in that way. I will definitely have a link to that video in the description of this video. So anybody who has not seen that, or if you have, go watch it. It was really well done. But in line with that, what I'd love to do is play a little game with you. And I'm going to call this an ode to code. So what I'm going to do is give you an Angular word, and then we're going to see if you can come up with like an Angular related Dr. Seuss-esque rhyme that would go with that Angular word. So are you up for this challenge?
No, but we're gonna do it anyway.
Okay, okay. Let's see. Let's see what you can
See what
come up with.
happens.
Okay. All right, we'll start with a fairly familiar word. I think if you've learned Angular even just a little bit, you've probably heard the word component.
Component. Okay. So you're building an app, it's yours and you own it. The first building block that you need is a component.
Oh, hey, that was awesome. Excellent. Okay, I love it already. And okay, next one is a little bit more difficult. ng on a knit.
Oh, good. That's yeah, because that's a phrase that you use in a sentence all the time. Okay.
I was hoping the it part would be easier to rhyme with.
So it's tricky, right? You could definitely do that, but that's not satisfying. But fortunately, this is how my brain works, and I've put a little thought into this. So
Oh, good. Okay.
um you want hooks for your life cycle. You're in it to win it. The first one to know about is ng on init.
Nice. Dave, I actually think we should do this for real and like have a whole YouTube series on, because you know what, when I was a teacher, that was something I was terrible at it. I'm not a singer. And a lot of the other teachers would have like little sing-songy rhymes to help their students learn things. And I was just like, sorry, kids, like we're not singing. So I'd play videos for them. But this I think would be smart. You could help people learn Angular through Dr. Seuss rhymes.
I did a while ago,
Did you?
and that's why I was able to come up with some of these. I did a while ago, like back when I was first learning Angular. I put together a few rhymes like this. It
Nice.
helped me out, and but it's not always easy. So
No,
not
no, it's
everything
not.
rhymes particularly well. So
True. Yeah, yeah. It's like Schoolhouse Rocks, but Angular
right,
style. Yeah.
I love it.
Cool. Okay, one more. Let's see if
Okay,
you can do this one. And
okay.
maybe just the second word. I don't know that you need to do both words, but this one is trickier, I think. So it's dependency injection.
Yeah, I don't know what to do about dependency.
So just do injection.
Injection you can do, because that's um, uh, reuse some features. Hey, I've no objection. One way to go about this is dependency injection.
Oh, nice.
I'm really hoping I'm using those. Like someone or there's an Angular dev who's like, that's not actually what you do, but it's good enough. So
No, I think that was awesome. Oh, I'm feeling inspired already.
I'm glad.
Yes. But okay, so with that, everybody, let's dive into this topic. And like I said, we want to talk about documentation and how we can really use the Angular docs to learn, be that from a beginner's perspective or even from more advanced. But one thing I think that I'd like to really just kind of put out there right from the beginning is that you actually were not familiar with Angular like at all. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but help me understand that. So my understanding is that your training, your expertise is technical writing, not necessarily programming or development, right? So
That's right.
you had to come in and get familiar enough with Angular and learn it yourself. And that's where I think your perspective is so amazing, because you had to learn it so that you could turn around and write the documentation. Like, that's amazing to me. So kind of walk us through that. I think that's a cool story just waiting to be told.
Sure. One thing about technical writing is that it's a very odd vocation to get into. It's one of those career paths that I don't think a lot of folks think about. And so if you talk to 10 technical writers, you'll get 10 different stories of how they ended up doing what they do. In my case, I was an English major in college, actually focusing on poetry,
Oh, cool.
but which probably explains the Dr. Seuss side of things. But obviously, I wanted to actually pay rent, so being a poet wasn't really necessary or a good idea. The friends I had in college were all computer science majors. And so
Hmm.
I was very fortunate to be in an environment where code wasn't something to be afraid of.
Okay.
And when I started looking for an actual career, someone said, "Oh, well, you can actually make a career out of describing how to use, software and APIs." And I'm like, "Sure, I can do that. I love explaining things." So that's how I got into it. And throughout my career, because there really, in many ways, there aren't enough technical writers.
Right.
They're really hard to find for a number of reasons. That would be a whole different episode to talk about. But the challenge with so few technical writers, you end up moving around from project to project. It's very difficult to really get embedded on anything. It might not be true if you stay with maybe a smaller-ish company, but the companies I've been working for, Microsoft and Amazon and Google, and it's not uncommon to spend a couple of years on something and then move on to something else. So but fortunately, you don't have to be an expert to write the documentation. In fact, in some ways, you don't want to be an expert. There's a concept called the curse of knowledge, which is basically a way of saying you are not your user. So when you are too close to a product, whether that's a software application or a programming language or whatever, the
Yeah.
closer you are to it, the harder it is for you to kind of take a step back and say, what are people going to need to learn about this? And a technical writer is often very good at filling that role, especially when they move from project to project. So
It's
when I joined Angular, I knew JavaScript because I think JavaScript for a lot of folks is a very easy language to sort of poke
right.
around in. And I knew that, but I had no idea about frameworks. I had no idea about the environment. And for me, it was a matter of, okay, here is a tool that is intended to solve a set of problems. My job is to then help those users solve those problems. And
Mhm.
that's how I approach any documentation project.
Okay. How much of the documentation was already there? Like, how built out was it already by the time you came in and started working on it?
So there was a lot. Angular has been around for quite some time, and
Mhm.
they've built up quite a corpus of content. So there was quite a bit to work from, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's a
Okay.
blessing in that you don't have to start from scratch and document everything. Uh,
Right.
it's a curse because there was a lot of content there that uh, got maybe got a little stale. It's hard to
Mhm.
keep a content set up to date, or maybe it was restructured. I remember in particular when I joined, you can actually see this if you go back to the Angular docs and go to like version 8 or whatever. You'll see that some of the content was broken into two main categories, and it was fundamentals and something else like techniques or something like that. And I was like, I have no idea what those buckets of content mean. What is
Right.
fundamental versus what is a technique versus what is whatever. And so we had to kind of figure out how to restructure things. I also found content that still had paragraphs about, like, in Angular, what is now Angular JS, we did
Right.
it this way, and now
Right.
we do it this way. And like, that was like 5 years ago. No
Yeah.
one should worry about this anymore. But no one was paying attention to that particular topic, so no one knew to take it out.
Okay.
So having a lot of content to work with can, work both for you and against you.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying though, that like one thing you mentioned that kind of resonates with me that I think is a common, I guess, just difficulty or problem with when you're trying to teach other people about programming is that it's that you are so into it. You're so familiar and so used to the jargon, the syntax, the way you say things that you forget what it's like to be a learner. And so I can definitely appreciate how hard that would be to go into documentation with that, that has that kind of baked into it already, and try to rewrite it or organize it in a way that makes it so that someone who is completely unfamiliar with it could come into it and make sense of things. I can imagine that'd be really, really hard. But what were your main objectives then? Like, if it was already kind of laid out, you had a pretty good foundation to start with. What was it that Dave said, I'm going to go in there? And I know you already said you have, like, when you go in, there's always like your set objective. But for this in particular, what was it that you really wanted to update or improve or fix?
So I was very fortunate in that I was not alone. I had other writers that I could work with. So that allowed me to expand the scope of the things that we could do. I was also really lucky, and I wish I didn't have to say I was lucky. I wish this was just the default. But the Angular team is passionate about the documentation experience. They really wanted to have a great documentation experience. I've had many conversations with some of the senior leadership of the Angular framework, and they've always wanted to have great documentation. That makes my life a whole lot
Right.
easier. Not every team, unfortunately, prioritizes documentation in that way. So with those, with those two items sort of, available to me, I was able to shift my focus to kind of doing a couple of things. First, we had a policy of how do we make sure we add to the documentation in a logical way. I don't know if you're familiar with I think it's called the Winchester House, this famous house that is built in like with staircases to nowhere, and
Mhm.
doors that lead to nothing, stuff like that. Like,
Okay.
you don't want your docs to be in that state any more than
Right.
you want your application to be in that state.
Okay.
Um, so, figuring out where in the information architecture does a new piece of documentation belong, so
Right.
that when we add to it, we know where it goes. I sometimes refer to this as organizing the garage. In fact, I used that
Mhm.
analogy a lot when I was talking about the Angular docs, is that we needed to take everything that was in the garage and pull it out and hold it up and go, like, what is this? Why do we have this? And I would go to an engineer, like, why is
Yeah.
this here? Is this still important? Sometimes the answer was yes, and we'd find a spot for it. And sometimes the answer was no, and we would get rid of it. Um, the other goal that I had was to make documentation part of the engineering practices. A
Okay.
lot of times documentation ends up being added at the end. We're done. Now let's document it. But
Mm.
that is no more a good solution than when you're testing an application saying, okay, I wrote the app. Now I'm going to test it. Most
Right.
developers would go like, no, you test as you go.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get into all sorts of problems.
Yeah.
So documentation should be the same. In fact, I think there are some talks out there about documentation driven development, which I think is a really good idea. So those were my primary goals, was to kind of,
Okay.
because that's more sustainable.
Right.
Writing documentation, lots of people write great content. Like there's lots of great content about Angular, about any other
Right.
framework or technology. The difference between content and documentation is documentation, especially the official docs, have to be maintained. So you can't just write something and go, I have now told you how to get started on Angular,
Right.
and then you never go back to that because you've now moved on to something else, right?
Right.
You know, the canonical documentation, the official docs, you can't do that. You have to be able to go back and look at it. And so building a system that is sustainable is really important.
Okay. So, all right. So a couple questions came out of that then for me
Right.
are like,
Yep.
one is how much does the Angular team actually help the technical writers? Like, is it something where if you just come across a question, you kind of go ping someone and they help answer that question? Or do they actually sit down with you and really help you develop the content that you're writing?
Both.
Okay.
Um, I always say that good documentation requires a subject matter expert, and that's
Mhm.
what we're talking about here, who has time to answer your questions.
Okay.
Because as you know, when you're writing software, whether it's a service or an app or whatever you're doing, there are lots of ways to write it. Not all of them are good ways.
Right.
And as a technical writer, if I find a way, I don't worry about making my code necessarily performant. I don't worry about it necessarily being production ready. So if I come up with a way that works, I'm going to be like, ta-da. But if that's not how it's supposed to be used, then I might never know that. So sometimes it's a matter of like, I don't know how this is supposed to work. Can you tell me what's going on here? And sometimes it's sitting down. I remember working on content about uh shoot, what was it? It was one of the more challenging parts of Angular. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It
Okay.
was like, I still have, like, I get to the content projection. That was it.
Hmm.
And I had to sit down with a subject matter expert so that they could explain to me how content projection worked with Angular.
Okay.
And because I wouldn't have figured that out on my own.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I'm finding this totally fascinating. And another thing that you mentioned, you said the word scope. And so that makes me think of, in education, there's a phrase called scope and sequence. When as a teacher, if you have a curriculum, like let's say you're teaching history or something, right? And you have a set curriculum that you have to teach in a particular year, or maybe even just a quarter or a trimester, whatever it is, but you would lay out your scope and sequence of what you teach first, how long you teach it for, what comes next, so that you can eventually get to that end goal. So when you use the word scope, that's kind of what comes to mind. But what, like, I think what I'd really love to kind of understand is when you set out to create your scope and sequence and kind of laying out the documentation start to end, what was, like, when you laid it all out, where did you start? How did you know what to start with versus like what to hold off on and work on later? What was kind of the thought process behind that?
The first thing I think about is the problem that we're trying to solve and
Okay.
who we are solving it for. So, not what does the code do, what is the problem that it's solving?
Okay.
And then who is reading this? What do they know? Are they an experienced developer? Are they brand new? Are they, an enterprise developer? Are they working for a smaller company? Who are these people? What do they need to know? And that's where I start from,
Okay.
trying to figure that out.
Which is interesting as well to me. And this is actually, I think, one of the hardest parts about teaching, be that in a classroom or creating a course. And I guess even with documentation, is you have people coming in at all different levels, people who are advanced, who've been doing this for years, people who are brand new. And that is what makes teaching an art, I think, because you have to masterfully put together something that students at any level can come in and get benefit out of. That's not easy.
Nope.
In teaching in a traditional classroom, it's called differentiated learning or teaching instruction, whichever, so that you're differentiating. You would have the same lesson plan, but you're making it so that student A, who's been doing this for 2 years already, can still go and have an exercise and practice at their level versus student B, who's brand new to it, and they would need some exercise and practice to go do it at their level. And that's differentiating your instruction. So with this, I'm totally fascinated or interested. Sorry, I'm totally curious, interested to know, how do you do that when you have people all over the world coming in at whatever level with Angular? How do you make one set of documentation that is approachable for any level?
You don't.
Okay.
What you and many people will try and fail. A good analogy is a recipe. If I give a recipe to someone who is a novice cook at home, that would be me. I need to know, you're gonna cook the pasta you're gonna bring the water to the boil. You're gonna cook the pasta for 7 minutes. You're gonna drain the pasta. You're gonna do all these different things. I need a lot of help. If I give that same recipe to a chef at a restaurant, they're gonna be annoyed as all get out because I'm over explaining everything, and they just need to know: cook the pasta, make the marinara sauce, do the thing. What you can do is try to put the user in control as much as possible. So what I try to do when I'm writing is I try to be upfront about what you're reading, why it's important, where you might go if this isn't the information you're looking for, and what sort of prerequisite knowledge do you need in order
Okay.
to get the most out of this. And that way, if ideally within the first couple of sentences, you'll know as a reader, is this where I want to be?
Right.
Not. This is kind of the problem, I think, that answer sites, like, I love Stack Overflow, but if you go to Stack Overflow, it's like, I have this question, you have no idea like who the person is, what their
Right.
situation is, and the answers can be anything from like the super basic to the, oh well, what you need to do is like some weird esoteric
Complicated.
thing. um, and a lot of the answers are good and everybody is well-meaning, and that's fantastic. But that's one of the challenges, is we have to put the user in control of self-differentiating. I am not experienced with this. I need to go learn how to do this. The Angular docs, for example, if you look at the getting started, the tour of heroes, we start off by saying you should understand JavaScript,
Right.
HTML, CSS, TypeScript. Can you go through Tour of Heroes without a deep knowledge of those things? Probably. I'm sure many people do, but I at least want you to know, so that when you go, wait, what is this,
Right.
variable colon any, what I don't know what that is. What's going on with that? Oh, that, that you need to go learn maybe how TypeScript works.
Right.
Yes, I used any, and I'm sure there are people who are like, but it was the first one that came to mind, and I apologize.
No, that's good. The fact that you knew that, though, you know what you're doing.
I pick things up.
You do.
So.
Well, okay, so then let's take that same question almost, but flip it, because I asked it from you, the writer's perspective, but now from the learner's perspective, how would you recommend that a beginner approach to Angular docs versus someone who's more experienced? Like how can you kind of help them to go through and make the most of the documentation at those at different levels, if that makes sense?
I would say have a vision of what you want to accomplish, and be honest with yourself, not self-deprecating and not, whatever, but honest with yourself about where you're starting from. So think of learning an instrument, right? I would like to learn piano. Well, if you go, okay, what do you want to do? I want to learn piano. Well, there's a lot there. Like what do
Right.
what do you want to learn? Do you like jazz? Do you like classical? Do you like ragtime? Do you like, rock music? What are you looking for? Like, put in that thought so that you know what you're trying to get out of it, because there's a lot to Angular and you don't need to know all of it, right? There's animations and all sorts of things that you could be doing.
Right.
But having a vision of what you want to get done will be really helpful. I think a lot of experienced developers do that by default, right? Whether, if you're working for a larger shop, like they're going to say, we need this. Oh, okay. Well, then I need to know how to do that. So I'm going to go
Right.
learn. That's my vision. That's what I need to do. Or I have a feature I want to develop or a problem I want to solve. And then being honest about where you're starting from, I think, is also really important. So it's okay if you don't know things.
Right.
I, when I first started learning about Angular, I mentioned that I was familiar with JavaScript, but JavaScript is vast, and it
Right.
changes, and I didn't know enough. So I went back and I was like, I need at least a little bit of understanding of how JavaScript is supposed to work and what the current, best practices are, so that I can then go back and apply that knowledge to the, what I'm learning about Angular. Um, it's, you know, it's just worth it to have that vision for yourself so that you can check whether you're going off, off the rails, or you're going, in the wrong direction or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the common phrase too that people will use is going down the rabbit hole. It's so
Mhm.
easy to get interested in one topic and then keep digging into it and digging in and digging in. Pretty soon you've I won't say wasted. Sorry, I shouldn't say wasted, but you've explored, you've used your time in a way that maybe you hadn't intended to originally. But yeah, it is easy. So I like that, going in with that clear objective of what is it that I'm trying to do here. You mentioned there though your experience with going in and getting familiar with Angular through the documentation. So I know it'll be different because the docs were different then than they are now, but I do think your experience is, I think there's something to be learned from that. So when you were learning Angular, did you find that there were things that were more difficult to learn or understand than other parts of Angular? Or even easier? Were there things that were easier to learn than other parts?
Um, I think I found the basics. One thing I like about Angular is the tour of heroes, and I like it for a couple of reasons. It's a pretty robust tutorial, as tutorials go. It spans multiple, topics. It covers just about everything. But what I liked about it is that it it let me walk through it, and it gave the problem that it was solving to me, so that, because sometimes you don't always know exactly what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So, like we need to populate a list, and we need that list to come from here, and here's how we go do that. And I'm like, oh, okay. The other thing, by the way, I like about Tour of Heroes is the fact that it's Tour of Heroes, not we're going to make a grocery list, which is
Yes.
fine. But I love personally examples that are just a little bit quirky, because it
Yeah.
helps it stick in your mind a little bit better.
Yeah. Yep. Not the
So,
to-do list.
so I found that like a really good way of kind of introducing myself to things.
Okay.
And some of it made, and then of course I tried my hand at like building a little app of my own and trying, you should always be willing to explore and try and see what happens. We are fortunate that a lot of the programming languages, a lot of the things we're learning to do, what's the worst thing that happens? You write something and it does not work. I mean, like that happens to people all the time. So go ahead and write something that doesn't work and then go figure out why it didn't work.
Yeah.
Things that were harder to understand were some of the more complicated scenarios, right? You know, content projection, for example, I was like, why are you doing this? You know, I started I wouldn't say I have a complete, even now, a complete understanding of it, but some of the more complicated scenarios are important for some folks, but were because I wasn't used to what the problem was,
Mhm.
I wasn't ready for the solution. So
Okay.
that was a challenge.
So what do you recommend then? Like, let's say somebody's going through the docs and they come across something that's just not, like, they just cannot wrap their mind around it. How can they work through that and maybe use other parts of the documentation or not? But like, what do you recommend if there's just something that's just like, dang it, I just can't get this. What do I do? Where do I go?
So the first thing that I would recommend is to be kind to yourself. Um, it takes uh, it takes time to learn how to do things. And sometimes we're so focused on getting it done that we're really hard on ourselves when we don't get it right off the bat.
Right.
Um, so taking a step back and saying, I don't understand how this works. This is not making sense to me. That's okay, right? It's okay to feel that way. Um, I feel that way all the time when I'm learning something new, and I just have to get used to it. The the next thing to do, or what I do and I would recommend is, see what else is in the docs, right? If it's calling an API and I don't understand what the API is, maybe go look at the API reference and what's out there. Uh, Go out and look at on the internet and go see maybe someone else has written something about it. Maybe they've done a video or a tutorial, and see if just like with teaching, right? Sometimes the teacher matters and you learn really well from one teacher and you don't learn as well from another. So sometimes it's just a matter of like getting told in a different way,
Yeah.
uh, so that it clicks. Um, Keep trying, maybe you're the type of person that wants to keep trying it out. Do that, right? Maybe reading about it isn't good enough. Maybe you need to, create, set up an environment and just see it work. And then you can go, oh, now I see what this is doing.
Yeah.
Uh, those are things that I would recommend. The last thing that I think is also really important is hold the docs that you're reading accountable.
Mm.
So there's a tendency, I think, for everybody to read a documentation, and if it doesn't make sense, they just go, ugh, and they go off to, they go off somewhere else, maybe figure it out on their own or whatever. As a writer, as a technical writer, go back and click that feedback button and tell people that you struggled with this.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that we're going to immediately jump and change it,
Right.
right? But it gives us a data point that we can then use to say we need to keep an eye on this.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're the outlier and it makes sense for 99% of the people, and you happen to be the one that like it just didn't make sense for you, and that's
Yeah.
happens. But don't just go like, oh well, the docs suck, I'm going to move on. No, take
Yeah.
the time and let people know so that we can figure out what to do about it. So
It's interesting because when you say that, it makes me think of when I was first getting into programming, and I remember being at that first job and going in and seeing some code that like I just couldn't make sense of it. And I kept beating myself up over like, why am I not getting this? Why am I not getting it? And I remember my mentor came in and looked at it, and he immediately said, well, have you considered that it's not you? that maybe it's the code that was written poorly and that's why it doesn't make sense to you. So I like that advice though. And I think everybody as a programmer can relate to that, because there are those moments when you get into the job and it's like, oh yeah, it actually isn't me. And there's a reason why this is hard for me to understand, because what's there and what's existing is the problem. It's actually not me. So I think that's an important reminder though, just that not to be hard on yourself, because it's so easy to start feeling dumb or imposter syndrome. And yeah, I think absolutely you hit that on the head. But you kind of mentioned though, like there is potentially a weakness with the documents, and I don't want to ask this question like as a way to slam on any weaknesses with the Angular documentation. It's not why I want to ask this next question. It's more of documentation in general. And so what I'd like to kind of discuss is there, I think a lot of times people, that's their first response is, if I have a question, if I have a problem, we'll go to the Angular docs. But when should somebody choose to turn to the Angular documentation for answers versus a blog article or a video or a tutorial of some kind?
So I actually think that the official documentation for Angular should always be the first place you go, because the Angular team is motivated and dedicated to make sure that it represents the best, what they think is the best way to do things. Without getting myself in trouble, but maybe I will. There are a lot of well-meaning people out there who create how to get started using Angular or how to do this with Angular or whatever, and they are expressing their opinions. But they are also motivated by page views and links and things like that.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. But it does, how motivated are they to go back and make sure things are up to date? That's my question. When I read a blog post, for example, on how to do something, I immediately jump to the comments, because especially with code, inevitably there's going to be someone who goes, yes, this worked until 6 months ago when version 3.7 of this dependency rolled out, and now you have to do it this way. Did the author go back and update their blog post? No, of course they didn't, because they have other things to do.
Right.
So always start with the Angular, with the official docs, and then supplement with other data sources as needed. And I would say that's true for Angular. I would say that's true for just about anything that you're trying to learn about. If I need to learn Git, I go learn from the documentation for Git. And then if I don't understand how something works, I go see how other people talk about it and see if that clicks. That's the model I use.
Okay. I love that. Yeah. I think and you're right, because that's been one of my biggest complaints with articles from the beginning is, like, especially as a junior developer, you're not really, I don't know, you get so used to people saying, well, go Google it. So you go Google it, and then come to find out that like 10 of the articles there are outdated. And so you've been sitting there studying something that is no longer relevant. So a couple last questions then.
Okay.
Are like, one is just, how often do you recommend, if at all, like someone actually start at the beginning of the documentation and just read straight through it, rather, because I think a lot of people have a particular question or problem they're trying to solve and they'll go look up that topic. But do you actually recommend people start at the beginning and go all the way to the end? And if so, do you think that's once a month, or once a year? Like, how often would you say to do that?
I never do that.
Okay.
I think that you're talking about one of the things that drives me crazy about documentation, that we have been writing documentation for decades and we still use the model
Mm,
for presenting information.
yeah.
No, when I write the best documentation I write, I assume that that is both the middle of the journey and the beginning of the journey and the end of the journey. And I don't know whether you're coming to this and it's the first topic you've ever read, or if it's the, last topic you're going to read about this. So there are some people who go like, oh yes, I start with the beginning of the docs and I read all the way through to the end. And I'm like, well, good for you. I don't have that kind of time.
Yeah.
I've tried to get rid of the book mentality. I've given up on that. It's too entrenched at this point. And so I haven't given up, but I've slowed down on it.
Mhm.
But I prefer to think of the documentation more like a library.
Okay.
You don't go into a library and go, well, here I am in the A section, and I'll start here. And then that would be ridiculous. You don't have that
Right.
kind.
Yeah.
Same with the docs. What do you do in the library? You have an idea that you need to learn about. You go find that book, and then you go read. You go look for the information you need, and then you put that book back.
Yeah.
If you need more information, you go find another book, or you read more about the book that you've got, and you go from there.
It's a
Not
great
very
analogy.
much, but
Yeah.
that's what I like.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. So then last question is just, now that you've gone through, like, you yourself have been a learner of Angular, you've experienced that, not knowing the framework and then going through using the documentation to get familiar with it. And then you actually took part in writing the documentation. So with all of those different experiences, what do you recommend for a new learner, and then also for people who are more experienced? What is like your kind of final recommendation, your final thoughts here on how different leveled programmers should go in and really use the documentation to learn and improve their skills?
So I would start, if I was new to Angular, I would start with a tutorial. I think the Angular doc still has two different tutorials. They're very similar. Both are very good. Do one of them, do both. That will give you a good insight into the sort of the main pieces of Angular that you should know about, components, templates, directives, dependency injection. And then, customize what you need to know from there. To use a teacher model, right? I'm sure like I've never been handed a textbook and been told to read the textbook from start to finish. Usually it's like, we're going to read this chapter. We're going to skip this chapter because maybe that chapter isn't good, or maybe it's not relevant, or maybe there's something else we want to do instead. But get the basics, and then you can start kind of pick and choosing what you need to learn. Get comfortable with the documentation set, so that you kind of, people say they love the Angular docs, and that's because they've gotten comfortable with it. They
Mm,
know how to find it. We can do better at making all types of technical documentation easier to search and navigate. But the more comfortable you get with it, the easier it is. It's like a recipe book. I keep switching analogies, I'm sorry, but I have 5 favorite recipes. I go in, the book almost opens to those pages. I sort of know where to go to look for those things. For a more experienced person, I would actually say keep your growth mindset. You're always a beginner. Don't let your ego get in the way. You could be amazing at building something with Angular, but have never touched animations.
mm,
Then you're a beginner at learning animations. Apply that beginner's mindset, that growth mindset, and uh, you know, explore it that way. Lean on the API reference, because you're going to be going there a lot more often, because you're going to try to, how do I call this? What's the response I'm expecting? That kind of thing. And again, I'll make a plea that if you are more experienced, take the time to make sure that the signposts are there for the people who come after you. If there's a gap in the information, if there's something not clear, make it clear. file that bug, submit that PR, do whatever to make the experience for the person coming after you all the better.
Nice. Yeah. I love it. I love it. Yeah.
I'll just share one other thing that I think people should keep in mind is
Okay.
when you're learning something new, allocate 20% of your time for a breadcrumb trail. So what I mean by that is not just to know where you came from, but also like when you come across something that's inaccurate, take time to let people know about it. Or if you can't find something, take time to file that bug, to send that email, to do whatever, so that the people who come after you might have a better experience.
Mm.
Sometimes we're so focused on our own learning that we forget that it's really a collaborative effort.
Thank you so much. Like all of this, like I said, so much of that was just fascinating, but the advice you gave, I think at any level, people can watch this and really draw a lot of knowledge and information from it. So thank you for your time and sharing all of your experiences. I would love if you're okay for people to connect with you. I think we should make this new thing where it's like Dave's Dr. Seuss Angular rhymes or something. I don't know. So everybody, I think, go and ask Dave if he can make a rhyme for you with your Angular words. But you can find him on Twitter. And I think I'm saying this right. Tell me if I'm wrong, but is it Ike Thoughts?
Right.
Ike?
Ike Thoughts.
Okay.
IKI Thoughts. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And I think that's a karate, or is it jujitsu?
It's Aikido, which is a martial art I used to teach. So I just sort of applied Aiki to a bunch of different things, and that one stuck.
Okay. So AIKI Thoughts.
That's right.
Perfect. And then, like I said, I'll put the link to your Dr. Seuss ng-conf talk in the description for this video. Please go watch that, everybody. And Dave, I always love connecting with you, so I'd love to have you back sometime. We can maybe dig into a particular topic or something, but thank you. And yeah, I hope that you have many adventures out exploring Washington.
It's been an absolute pleasure being here. Thank you for letting me talk about these things and asking such great questions. And this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks.